the organizational aspects are equally important, if not more important, than the ethical aspects we've been discussing for the past 4 years now. And I mean, we got the principles and we got the frameworks. So in that regard, I think we did all we could. We even did a meta-analysis and meta-review studies of these frameworks to come up with even more overarching frameworks and principles.
Hello and welcome to a whole new episode of Engati CX. I am your host Drishti, and today we have a technology expert with us on the show. But before I introduce you to our guest, allow me to introduce you to the magic of Engati. Engati is the world's leading multilingual no-code chatbot platform, available across 14 channels with 35,000 bots created across 186 countries in every domain and use case. Engati has also been recognized as a top platform by INC, Tech World, CIO, and many others. We run the Engati blog, video channel, and the Engati CX podcast, receiving upwards of 300,000 visitors annually. And now for our guest, Joris Krijger is an AI and ethics specialist at Volksbank, a Dutch retail bank that offers financial products to both companies and individuals. He's got a background in economic psychology and media studies. Joris has also conducted research projects on disruptive technologies. His current work focuses on developing ethical guidelines on developments in AI, and he is currently in the process of achieving his PhD in philosophy and law from the Erasmus University of Rotterdam. So, hi Joris, we are really happy to have you on Engati CX.
Yes, thanks for having me.
So before we dive into the interview with Joris, do not forget to subscribe to Engati and tap the bell icon below to get access to exclusive content from thought leaders around the globe. So to begin with, Joris, how much is the general awareness of ethics in AI?
Well, actually, it's increasing because what you see from 2016 onwards is that the risks of using and deploying AI systems have become increasingly apparent after some incidents in that regard. And actually a study was conducted on this. And what you see is that from 2016 onwards, almost 84 guidelines and ethical principles for AI, 84 different policy documents containing ethical principles for ethics and AI have been published. So you could say that the ethical part of AI is actually booming in parallel with the attention AI in general is getting at the moment. So yeah, the awareness is growing, but the concern on the same time is that the awareness is growing in data science communities and perhaps from a policy perspective. But within organizations, you see that there is a tendency to do something with ethics and AI. However, what that something should be is not clear to everyone. So that's the topic of my research as well. I do a PhD on how do you operationalize these abstract, high-level ethical principles and implement them in your business practice.
So how do we go about developing ethical guidelines in AI development?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because there have been a lot of frameworks and ethical principles. And what you see when you look at the background of those principles is that they are really converging towards some common ethical principles that are common in all forms of applied ethics, so in bioethics, in environmental ethics, and so on. And these are beneficence, non-maleficence, so do good, avoid doing harm. There's really common principles. But the challenge to me, at least, is it's not coming up with guidelines or coming up with more principles, because as I said, in 2019, we already had 84 documents from various groups containing these principles. And to give you an idea of what these principles are, you should think of transparency and explainability. So AI models, especially the self-learning AI models, we should be able as humans to comprehend their output and how they derived at a certain decision, for example. But also fairness is, of course, a huge problem, because when these systems learn from historical data, they can induce or have some form of inductive discrimination and thereby negatively affect certain subgroups. And yeah, there are lots of famous examples of this. I'll give you just one from Amazon. They had an HR tool, maybe you are familiar with it, but they just fed the historical data of the past 10 years of their application process. And what the system derived from that data was that female candidates are less good actually for software development positions within Amazon. And so even before these applicants reached the person in HR, they were just filtered out by the algorithm for applications in this position. And so here you see that some sort of a gender bias is introduced actually in the system, and you get some sort of gender bias on a structural skill. So that is highly problematic, and of course fairness should be one of the key principles when we use and deploy AI. However, when I started working at the bank 1.5 years ago, because I did the work with the bank in parallel with my PhD at the university, I came in with these principles and I said, guys, we really have to do something with fairness. And the first thing the data scientist said to me was like, yeah, we have 21 definitions of fairness. So which definition of fairness should we do something with? Because mathematically speaking, you can go to either one of these 21. And that's when I realized, okay, the challenge is perhaps not in the principles, because we all agree that fairness is important. We all agree that privacy is important, but perhaps the challenge is in how we operationalize those principles. And so I think if you want to come at certain guidelines or principles, that's fine. And there's plenty of material out there that already give a very good first approach to how we should go about having some sort of ethical framework for AI. However, the challenge, I think, is really in how do we bring these abstract principles into practice when you have such different interpretations of various ethical principles. And that's, of course, always the challenge with ethics, because we all have a different interpretation of certain values. And in a business context, and I think especially in a data science context, it's really important because data science and algorithms make these decisions really explicit. You really have to choose, do I go for performance in this model, or do I want to have some fairness constraints that will lower this performance, for example? And these sort of trade-offs, they have to be tackled within an organization, whether that's a governmental organization or a corporation. But I think these sort of trade-offs have to be tackled, and there should be some form of accountability around how these trade-offs are handled within an organization, because even not addressing them is some sort of an ethical choice in that sense, because then automatically speaking, you go for optimization of performance, which can have, as I already pointed out with the Amazon example, can have negative effects for certain subgroups.
So yeah, I had a similar discussion with a expert before. So it is the algorithmic bias that we create at first, and then we create systems or automation on top of that algorithmic bias. And it is not like the system can create a bias by itself. It is because of the data or the skewed data which is given, or the logic that we have created at first when creating that automation side. So that is what will eventually give out such results even coming from the system. So yeah.
True, yeah, but in some sense, even when you have unbiased data, the outcome of your model can still be biased. And a famous example in this regard is the Compass algorithm that was used in the United States. I'm pretty sure if you did something with ethics and algorithms, you've heard about it. But it's a recidivism prediction algorithm that is used to establish, for example, the parole of detainees. So it was used, and basically, well, there's a lot of discussion about this, but in 2016, I believe, ProPublica did a study because this recidivism prediction algorithm basically looked and established how high the risk is that you will reoffend. And they went and checked, I believe, 6,000 cases between 2013 and 2014. And they checked whether these people did indeed reoffend. And they found that the error rates for whites and black people were really discriminatory. So the system would often indicate that a black person was a higher risk, even though they wouldn't reoffend. And the other way around, it would say that a white person has less risk, even though they would more often reoffend. So even though that data may be unbiased, and you can say, well, how unbiased is it in the United States and so on. But you can still, just by the way the model works, have some question marks about the ethical outcomes of such systems. So it's absolutely true that data is really important, and bias and historical bias and implicit bias in data is a really important aspect. But I think we should also be aware of the outcomes of an algorithm and how desirable those outcomes are, and especially the way the outcomes influence or interact with the environment. Right. So that's what we do within the bank as well. We just say we look at the whole chain, starting from data, but ending with the interaction with users or employers, because that's the only way to estimate whether an algorithm really performs as we intended to perform. And we cannot just look at the data or the model itself and say, well, this is a perfectly ethical model, because we can have perfect predictions, but when it influences someone's behavior, say that they start spending more on conspicuous goods than they should, for example, because they get some signal from the bank saying, hey, you have, I don't know, $200 left this month, then in the end, you see that the outcome is undesirable. And so I think you should take that into account when you talk about ethics and AI as well. It's not just about data, model, and outcomes. It's also about the impact they have on the real world.
Yeah, that's true. So how can these ethical risks of bias and overly complex decision making be minimized?
Now that's a really interesting question, because that's of course the $1 million question. How can we mitigate these ethical risks and do so in a responsible way? And the way I look at this question is that we should have some form of accountability or responsibility structure in place in the first place. Because to me, it seems that's the first step. When within an organization these responsibilities are known, there is an awareness of these risks. That's the first step to actually doing something with ethical values in the design of your models. And so what we thought was, how can we implement or embed these ethical values within an organization, in this case the bank where I work for. And the way we went about it was by first checking, like, who is ultimately responsible now for an algorithmic design. And what we came up with was that actually the data scientist is responsible for the ethical decisions as well. So he, as being the most knowledgeable person in this domain, gets to choose which interpretation of fairness he likes, which interpretation of privacy. And he just gets requests as being part of the modeling team from, I don't know, marketing or whatever department you can think of, and he makes those models, and it is expected from him or from her that they check whether there is some ethical bias there and those sort of things, but they are not equipped to make those decisions, and they don't feel comfortable to make those decisions. And rightfully so, I would say, because this is not like an individual decision choice. Right. It's something an organization should give guidance on, organizations should give tools for, and in the end, I think the organization should be accountable for the decisions being made in the model development process. Right. And of course, you can speak of a sort of composite responsibility here, because it cannot all be the organization. Then you get the problem of the many hands again. But I think it should be very clear in the first place that it shouldn't be the data scientist who ultimately ends up making these choices for what interpretation of fairness to choose. And what I found at the bank was that they were really happy, even though they're a bit skeptical of ethics, of course, because we are the people who always tell them no. But in this case, I think we changed that for the better, because the way we look at these models and algorithms is, we said, how can we do this in a more ethical way? And how can we do this in a responsible way, where you have your responsibility in, for example, signaling or finding these ethical risks, and we'll provide guidance and help with that. We have some tools that can help you in finding these ethical risks, but then we provide them with an ethical advice from an ethical office, which is a new entity we created in the organization exclusively for this task, so to speak, to check on algorithmic development and the potential ethical harms there. So we provide them with an ethical advice that is seen by a lot of different directors within the organization. And so they get an advice that is backed up by the entire organization, and they know that if we execute this advice, or the points in this advice, then we know we did the right thing. And even though, I mean, it's machine learning, so it's still, you never exactly know what happens, but
Right.
at least we can justify the choices we made, and we can say, look, we thought of this and this and this, and based on these points, we made the following decision. And I think that is a very important first step of implementing these ethical principles, that actually being aware that there are some ethical aspects of your development, and that you are able to justify the decisions you made in regard to these ethical principles.
That's true. That's absolutely right.
I'm glad you agree.
Can you explain the term organizational operationalization of AI ethics?
Yeah, that's because that's basically the term I use to describe what I've been saying before. What I noticed was that on the one hand, in AI and ethics, we have these abstract and high-level principles, and on the other hand, we have things as value-based design and value-based design methods.
Yeah.
So we're really on the developer and development level. And I noticed that there's seems to be almost nothing in between, which is the big gray area of the organization. And my challenge is to look at how can we embed these abstract principles within an organization, so that it's not the task of the developer anymore to have this discussion about values. Because I mean, they should, for some applications they should, but it shouldn't be their responsibility solely to have this discussion. And also they should have some tools and some guidance on how to have this discussion and what to do with the outcome, because that's the next thing. And that's been shown in studies as well, that when you have these value-based design methods, it's all nice and well, and everybody agrees, because no one is against world peace, so to speak. But then what do we do with the final design? And that's a really difficult question to answer. So I thought that, well, there should be some form of organizational operationalization. So not in the form of just specific designs or specific use cases, and not in the form of principles and high-level statements, but some specific organizational steps you can take to implement these ethical principles. And yet there is no such thing as a free lunch. So as an organization, when you say we want to do something with ethics and we want to implement these ethical principles, it means it will cost you in the sense of performance or in time or whatsoever. But I think if organizations want to implement these ethical principles, they should be committed to the ethical principles and the consequences. And I think it's a bit too laissez-faire to say, yeah, we have these principles, we just give them to our developers, and that will ensure that we have ethical results. And basically also a study has been shown to see whether that's true, and the effect of giving ethical principles to designers just before they design a certain software application compared to a control group that wasn't given these guidelines was near to zero. So it makes near to zero effect whether you give them these guidelines or not. So there should be something else, and we should do something else when it comes to implementing ethics, because just by themselves, I think data scientists, I mean, they're doing a great job with fairness dashboards, with explainability tools, but in the end, I think organizations should provide some guidance and should help them make the decision of these trade-offs. So that's what organizational operationalization means. It's a difficult word, but it just comes down to this, that organizations should take their responsibility.
Yeah. It totally makes sense that when it comes to, say, data scientists or developers, it is their responsibility to build, like you just said, but it should be a goal set for a complete organization, and the decision making power should not be on their shoulders. It should be something which is discussed and then passed on to them. So
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, in a lot of organizations, it's still the default setting that the data scientist has to do this. And I know, I mean, they are the most knowledgeable in this domain, so it makes sense to look at them. But when you really want to implement ethics and want to give it a place within your organization, and I'm lucky that the Volksbank where I work for, it's a state-owned bank, so we have room to move, so to speak, to really implement this ethics and to live up to the ethical standards that we have. And I understand that for a fully profit-aiming corporation, it must be a bit more difficult. But I think if you are committed to these principles, and in my opinion, every organization should be, because it's really important that we get this right when we introduce it, and not that we try to correct it a few years from now. We are starting this development in this AI boom now, and let's get it right in the first step and not later on, because along with the additional costs that will bring, it will also involve some additional harm that we can prevent if we do it right away. So I think it's really important that you give these ethical principles a place within your organization, not just as a policy, but as a way of doing business and as a way of just business as usual and common practice.
Right. So, what are the critical parameters that we need to control to ensure that the bias is very minimal? And like, if you can tell us based on your research about ethics and technology.
To be honest, that's still an open question for me as well. And I have this discussion within the bank as well, for example, because some data scientists say, and I think there's some legitimacy to that claim, that are we the ones who should correct social disparity, for example? Are we the ones who should solve these issues within our models? And to what extent can we even solve these major social challenges? And I tend to agree with them. I mean, there are various operationalization forms or formalizations of fairness. And as I said, they can at times be mutually exclusive. So it's really hard to select one. But what it also shows you is that there's like no one size fits all solution or one knob you got to tweak to say, now we got it right. So for me, that's still an open question, like what are the parameters? But as I mentioned, what is most important is first that you get your processes in place and that you can make sure everybody in this process knows his or her responsibility in this regard, and that we can justify the decisions we made concerning these ethical risks. Because there are a lot of sources for ethical risk in data development throughout the life cycle of an AI model, for example. You encounter a lot of ethical challenges and risks. But on the other hand, we should also say that, for example, the European Union has introduced an ethical technology assessment, which is really thorough. And I think it is warranted for some applications. When you look at the bank, for example, credit risk scoring could be one of the applications where you say, look, we really want to get this right and we need to get this right, because if you disadvantage certain groups in these type of models and they cannot get a mortgage, for example, because your model doesn't function well, that's inexcusable.
Yeah.
But for certain other applications, an entire ethical technology assessment, starting with questions like, did you perform a human rights impact assessment? That's really unnecessary, I would say, because there are some algorithms and AI models within organizations that have very limited impact on consumer society or impact. So of course you should check them. Of course you should make sure they are functioning as intended. But the ethical aspect is less present there. Yeah. So I think there's a challenge there. Like, how can we estimate the proportionality of ethical risks when it comes to these sort of systems? Because mainly in the literature, we discuss the 10% of most high-stake decisions that we give to algorithms, say breast cancer detection, say self-driving cars. And those are interesting discussions, but when you look at the world of business, so to speak, or when you look at where these algorithms are used most, I think 90% doesn't fit the description given in the high-stake for high-stake decision algorithms. So there's a whole area, 90% of algorithms, that's really hard to classify on how their ethical risks should be estimated. And I think that would be also another starting point to look at how can we determine what the actual ethical risk is of an application. And like, I'm not saying we should not regulate AI at all for certain applications, because from a technology philosophical perspective, we know that every form of technology has some sort of moral implication and some sort of ethical implication. Yeah. And we should be aware of it, even though it seems innocent. There can be potential harms that are again inexcusable. But I think if we want to get started with this, we should really know how to filter out the high stake, or not just the high stake, but also the maybe less high stake ethical risks that we still should pay attention to. And we should also say that for a certain group of applications, maybe regulation and the ethical risks are limited and should remain limited. Because this way we also get like the cooperation from data scientists. Because again, when I went very optimistically with the ethical technology assessment under my arm to the bank saying, we should do for every application that we have this technology assessment, they were like, you gotta be kidding, more paperwork, why? And again, I have to some extent to agree with them, because we shouldn't have to be doing this for all the applications, but you've got to make sure that you can justify the decisions you made for why you didn't do an ethical impact assessment. You should be able to be held accountable if you didn't do it and it turns out that there are some unanticipated harms there. But I think those are some starting points of actually getting the scope right of the ethical AI discussion, which shouldn't be focused on high decision algorithms. Of course, there should be a lot of discussion on these algorithms because they are high stake decisions. But I think there's a whole other world out there of algorithms and models that run within organizations that are perhaps not that exciting, and they will perhaps not get you that much research money studying them, but they're equally important to get right because they become or already are part of the fabric of society.
That's right. So, are there any other thoughts that you would like to leave with our audience?
No, I think I hope I got the message across that the organizational aspects are equally important, if not more important, than the ethical aspects we've been discussing for the past 4 years now. And I mean, we got the principles and we got the frameworks. So in that regard, I think we did all we could. We even did a meta-analysis and meta-review studies of these frameworks to come up with even more overarching frameworks and principles. So I think the self-referring field or discourse on AI ethics should actually be challenged by some practical insights, because so far I don't see a real discussion. And I think when we talk about ethical AI, it is political in a sense, and there should be debate because you can differ from an opinion from how these systems should work and how they should be implemented. And so far I've encountered too much agreeing and too much what you're doing is helpful, rather than look, you shouldn't look at it another way, or you should have this for example, a theory of justice. That's a thing I'm working on right now, to make sure when we ask the question of how you can estimate the risk, the ethical risks of an AI application, you have to have some form or some measure to say, look, against this measure, we can say that this is a risky application. And I think there's a lot of room for a debate there, because that's actually where I think it gets interesting, where it gets political. Because some people will say the more an algorithm will limit your autonomy, the more unethical it is, or the more it will limit your participation in public life, so to speak, the more unethical it is. And I think these sort of questions, they need to be proposed and they need to be addressed, because in the end it is a political field. And when we ignore the economic interests and when we ignore the organizational interests, yeah, to me, we are sort of mocking ourselves or kidding ourselves, saying like, yes, we're all being virtuous here and we all have these ethical principles. Some industries saying we will regulate ourselves. We don't need regulation. We got these principles. And I think you have to have eye for the organizational incentives and for the economic tensions that are there. And they should be addressed, and these trade-offs should be made explicit, I think, within an organization, and the decision organizations made on these trade-offs should also be made explicit, so that we as a public know what kind of decisions are being made when it comes to the models that actually govern us.
That's absolutely right. So thank you so much, Joris, for giving us your time. I think your insights have been really valuable, and the audience is really going to enjoy this interview.
I hope so. Yeah, thank you a lot for inviting me.
So we'll be back with a new episode with a brand new expert soon. So stay tuned and we'll see you around for the next one.